Everywhere you go in rural Ireland, you find places like this. Houses built mainly in the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, in which many generations grew up before moving out into the wider world, but have now been abandoned and fallen into ruin. There were 13 children in the last family to grow up here, 7 boys, 5 of whom played hurling for Offaly, and 6 girls, all of whom played camogie. But back in those days, there was very little in the way of inter-county competition in camogie. But it's not for family history or even for the vernacular architecture that we have come here, but to look at this wonderful plant. This is greater periwinkle, one of only 2 species in the dogbane or milkweed family, although the family as a whole is one of the largest and most extraordinary families of flowering plants, with something like 5,300 species in 400 genera. It has many ornamental species. Among the most familiar perhaps would be frangipani and oleander. But one of the most remarkable things about this extraordinary family is the way in which the basic floral plan of the family is exploited in a most remarkable way. But to see that side of the story, we'd have to make our way to Dublin and leave the woods and fields of the Midlands to visit the Botanic Gardens, where a few species find conditions that mimic the tropical and subtropical conditions, where the diversity and floral extravagance of the family is exploited to most effect. The corolla has 2 parts, rather like a primrose. This flat saucer-like upper part, and the lower part a deep corolla tube at right angles to the saucer. Looking into the flower is like looking down into a well, and about 3 millimeters down you can see the upper side of the buff-coloured anthers. If we take a sharp scissors and blade and cut the flower carefully in 2, the anthers are those hairy helmet-like structures, each attached by a little corbel to the wall of the corolla tube. They have split open to shed their pollen inwards into that mop of downward-pointing hairs on top of the wheel-like structure. And you can see the way the pollen grains of an entire anther, which are very large and very sticky, come off as a single glob. The style is shaped like a golf tee, and the rim of that orange wheel at the top, covered in white sticky stuff, is the receptive stigmatic surface. Notice the way the pollen clumps are on top of the golf tee, so they can't come in contact with the stigmatic surface. Nectar is secreted deep down the corolla tube by 2 prominent nectaries on either side of a 2-chambered ovary, difficult to access without a long tongue, and surrounded by a bristling forest of icicle-like hairs growing out from the wall of the tube, which prevents insects other than those the long-tongued ones the flower is targeting from helping themselves to nectar. The flowers are pollinated in mainland Europe by bees, especially bumblebees, and large flies, which land on the saucer of the petals to reach in for nectar. As they probe for the nectar, the hairy anther hood prevents the bee's tongue from contacting the pollen masses tangled in the hair underneath. Any pollen they are bringing with them will then adhere to the sticky ring of the stigma as they reach further down for the nectar, and as the tongue is withdrawn, the clumps of pollen under the hood will stick to the now very sticky tongue. However, the flowers receive very few visitors here in Ireland and rarely set seed, but it's easy to imitate the action of the insect's proboscis with a bristle, and if you do this, they will set seed freely. Greater periwinkle typically occurs in scrambling patches like this, where the strong trailing stems and dense evergreen foliage can bind down a hedge to the exclusion of everything else.
Periwinkle had a wide variety of uses in times past, many of them based on the idea that its binding properties could be applied to human conditions such as toothache or bleeding. The great 17th century herbalist Nicholas Culpeper suggested that if married couples were having trouble getting on together, eating periwinkle leaves would sort out the problem. Be that as it may, most members of the family are poisons, including some from which deadly arrow poisons were made. Today, some of the most important drugs and poisons are made from members of the periwinkle family, one of the most remarkable being the rosy periwinkle of Madagascar, from which two chemicals were extracted only as recently as the 1950s, which are among the most important anti-cancer drugs we have today. Vincristine has increased the survival rate from childhood leukemia from 5% to 95%, and vinblastine is used to treat Hodgkin's disease. Periwinkle has even managed to creep its way into English literature. In one of the verses in one of Wordsworth's most oft-quoted poems, lines written in early spring. Through primrose tufts in that sweet bower, the periwinkle trailed its wreaths. And 'tis my faith that every flower enjoys the air it breathes. And 'tis my faith that every flower enjoys the air it breathes.